David, you're looking great.
Well,
And
Webex can't accomplish that, but
yeah,
we'll
and
we'll go
and
with what
and,
we can.
and smiling faces are always the most beautiful faces in the world.
And David smiles a lot and laughs too.
Yes. So I think we would get a chance to meet you mm, offline, not online all the time, but and surely we'll time together. So I think now start.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. David Wilcox, founder Reach Scale Global Network, Mr. Satish Jha, scale leader and scale investors and chair EduFront Reach Scale in the Jha Group. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Good evening in India and good morning here in US and other parts. So on behalf of Vicky, I welcome uh, virtual conference being in partnership with Reach Scale in organizing this virtual conference for the benefit of our members, budding entrepreneurs, startups, CEOs, etc. Reachscale identifies the most innovative problem-solving social enterprises in the world and then finds their natural corporate scaling partners. The corporation makes miserable progress in solving the global challenge by scaling the social enterprises. Over the years, Reachscale evaluated thousands of scaling organizations worldwide and discovered that half of the top 20 worldwide scale successes originated in India. Today, we will discuss on the successful models and processes for scaling up your business and positively impacting your customers and communities. We have with us two distinguished experts, Mr. David Wilcox, founder of Rescale Global Network, and Mr. Satish Jha, scale leader and scale investor, who will be discussing the power of scale and how we can network to scale. Mr. David Wilcox has brought idea-driven and creative advocacy to his work with startups, Fortune 500 companies, and non-profit making organization. He has been a CEO, CMO, and head of business development amongst several other positions for a number of firms, including technological startups, consulting, think tanks, and digital enterprises. Hybrid background in business and social consciousness. He is currently focusing on global affordable health, housing, education initiatives, and save time in India with the tail leaders. Now, Mr. Satish Jha is an early stage investor, entrepreneur, and former C-level corporate executive with Fortune 100 companies with experience of over decades of scaling up social enterprises. Uh, He is instrumental in starting over 40 India-based global organization. Has also worked with major Indian scale leaders. Mr. Jha co-founded a national daily newspaper Jansatta for the Indian Express Group and was the editor of Dinaman, the weekly of the Times of India. His co-founded Digital Partners, one of the earliest impact investment bodies, and later merged with Grameen Technologies of Nobel laureate Mohammad Yunus. Among the 40 plus startup he invested in were acquired by GE, Walmart Group, and Genpact, among others. In addition to leading one laptop per child, which is OLPC in India, cherishes helping startups, PUCL. He actually helped in starting PUCL bulletin along with late Shri Arun Jaitley ji, former finance minister of India, among several other initiatives. Mr. Wilcox and Mr. Jha have combined their expertise to build networks that support Indian and global scale leaders, learning from both winners and failed efforts. They have designed frameworks that can aid you in scaling up. I believe this session is especially important for all the budding entrepreneurs, startups, and social enterprises who would want to use this scaling up opportunity. Over to you, Mr. Jha. I think you will now take it over from here.
Thank you, Gajendra. Thank you very, very much. And I appreciate Vicky inviting us. My name is Satish Jha, and I think I would like to say greetings of the day because our colleagues are spread all over the globe in Europe, US, and India. And so good afternoon to my friends in India, and good morning to Europe and US. Thank you very much. It's a privilege for me to have David Wilcox, a colleague and good friend, who is as passionate about scale and how to address any issue globally in a certain context, no matter what context you are, cover the entire uh, problem as such, as anyone I have seen in my life. And in some ways, very interesting. David went to Harvard Business School, and I went to study social sciences. And I got into business, and he is looking at social scale as such. So these are the interesting aspects of our lives. When I studied network for the first time while I was doing an MBA, network meant to me what we understand as telecom network. I did not think of network as human networks, social networks. In social sciences, network as a concept was not quite as commonly used at that point in time. I'm looking at early 80s, late 70s, early 80s when I went to college. And now when I met David and we began looking at scale used to mean, something we use for measuring in 12 inches. Now scale has become something which looks at a problem in a very, very different way. How do you cover the whole gamut as such? When I look at scale in the corporate sense and or global sense, what are the challenges which actually have been addressed globally at a scale where David would look at it as aspirational? Today, my first mind goes to Google. Anyone who uses screen knows the name of Google, uses Google. That effectively it covers 100% of humans who have ability to see a screen or use internet or have anything to do with digital world as such. They can't do without Google. Before that, almost 90 to 100% was Microsoft. Everyone touches it one way, one form or the other. You can't escape Microsoft. These organizations were born in the last 40 years. They looked at a challenge. A challenge was how do we make working with documents, communication easier? And they began with trying to create a small application, which becomes later on an operating system for running computers. From there, we come to the world of various things we do from communication, writing, speaking, video conferencing, everything is based on that platform, which began sometime around mid-70s. But they covered the whole space. Compared to that, think of any company in the non-digital world. They cover, even if they cover 50%, there's no company which covers more than a few percentage points in a global competitive space. What they do is they still solve problem by getting many companies to do the same thing. In other words, you can say that in the digital world, where there's a great digital democracy, we are looking at scale achieved by one company, while other spaces, the scale is achieved with the help of many, many, many companies. And you call them competitive space, call them network, call them whatever you will, and we'll get to that. And but the challenge is government addresses every issue at scale because its mandate is to look at everyone at the same time. It can't omit anyone. Private sector looks at a problem solving. They have to go from starting with one person and they scale up and they cover the whole space, just like in the case of Google or Microsoft or Apple or others. But that's a space which is not covered by either private or public sector. And that space is something which is being covered by social enterprises. But every single large corporation addresses one of those problems. For instance, long time back when we started something called Tarahat.com, which led to ITC looking at as Chopal or Hindustan, they were looking at Shakti. They tried to address that question. This is something the government doesn't address, private sector doesn't address. It falls in a certain space. How do you scale up there? And you heard of United Nations, sustainability, sustainable development goals, issues like that. They have 17 of them. I would say let's look at them in two different contexts. One, which are outcome oriented, and the other, which are around creating a platform, creating a framework, etc. I think the biggest issue the world faces where scale is required include poverty, education, health, nutrition, water, and communication is one area where the world has come together to address scale like nothing else. We go back to 1980s, it was impossible to think India could have everyone talking on the phone, even in 2100, 100 years later. But then 1995, India embraced cell technologies, and today nearly every Indian has handled that question of communication. Poor, even those who have only 5,000 rupees monthly income, which is way, way below poverty line, they end up using phone one way or the other. There are more phones in India than the population of India. And that's a very interesting fact. That's been totally covered as a scale. That's what David would call scale, I think. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's what I imagine his notion of scale will be. So communication is one we have covered. I don't know if it's SDG goal or not. I don't know if UN thinks it's as important or not, but surely it's not been the case with poverty eradication, with education, with health, with nutrition, with water, with sanitation. These are the questions. How do we as a society move in that direction? There's money to be made in everything, but money is made because we solve a major problem. And bigger the problem we solve, more money we make. Organizations become large, like, for instance, Waste Management is a Fortune 500 company in America. Effectively, any problem you look at, if you touch every Indian, you're looking at 1.4 billion people. And if they give you 10 rupees, you've got a 14 billion rupees company. Now, having said that, but businesses don't always think that way. They have their own challenges. Social space doesn't always think that way. From here, I want to pass it on to David. I'm going to have hopefully a very engaging conversation and understand how a Harvard Business School, died in the whole business executive and entrepreneur got into this space. And I'm requesting David. I'm looking forward to you enlightening all of us on what are networks and how do they help us scale.
Thanks, Satish. Appreciate it. Would like to welcome all my friends from India. We have a couple hundred people here, and 80% of them are physically in India, but another 20% are spread across the planet. They're represented in about 10 other countries, Germany, Switzerland, the UK, few friends in Nairobi, Mexico, the US. So we're glad to have a worldwide audience, and we're very thankful to Vicky for organizing this and working with Satish and I to put together this set of leaders, and we appreciate you joining. So India is a very unique place. And one of the unique things about it is that it's the only country in the world where a single question with an appropriate answer not only gets you in front of a minister, it gets that minister to invite their most talented people. It gets that minister to bring in their leaders. It gets that minister to say, you know, that stuff you were working on before, that's not as important now. We've now got a new set of things that we can do. And I'm curious if any of you are thinking what that one question would be, because usually you go to a ministry, they have their own needs, they have their own problems, they have their own set of questions. So why is India the unique place where there's a single question? And what is that question? So the minister's question is quite simple. Show me something that can scale. Education, water, healthcare, every single ministry will engage aggressively if you can show them something that can scale. But what does the minister mean when she asks that question? What is scale to the minister? Why is she asking, show me something that can scale? The answer is quite simple. Scale, and often at scale, as the sentences end, is seeing something at the level that solves the whole problem. Seeing a solution at the level that solves the whole problem. That is scale. Now, you'll also hear the term scale up. And in the case of scale up, it's measurable, significant progress towards solving the problem at scale. Generally, orders of magnitude of progress towards solving the problem at scale. So we now have a commonality across an entire country of 1.3 billion people, with every state, national, and even district level officer asking, show me something that can scale. Back to you, Satish.
Same question all along. Any government has to look at, I've heard the same question all along, any government has to look at how to scale up. How can you solve problem for everyone? Once the Chief Minister of Rajasthan asked me, can you address primary health care for every citizen of my state, every Nagarik of my state, in a certain defined budget? And I like the question because it was addressing every single citizen of the state. Every single chief minister spoke the same language. That at the level of national prime minister, Aadhaar was supposed to solve every single person's challenge of proving their identity. So governments think exactly that way. Having said that, in the field of, in some places they have succeeded. Polio Plus, my wife founded that in 1987, and every child was covered, so it can be done. Aadhaar, I don't know if it's actually covered 100% or not, is on the way to that place. I don't know how good it is, I can't comment on that, but the fact is, it is aiming to cover scaling up. But why does it not happen in the case of education? Why does it not happen in the case of healthcare? The question is, it hasn't happened in the case of healthcare in even the US. So how would you, David, approach when it comes to addressing SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are key to human progress, for instance, helping even the last man have literacy, not more than literacy, knowledge, having ability to deal with the world of today means internet literacy, digital literacy, and or the equipment to handle the problems, challenges of the day that we face. How do we address the question of healthcare, sanitation, water, nutrition, the questions which are relevant for every human being at the baseline level, which neither the government nor the private sector have handled. And how can they handle it in a way that's profitable? It's viable, it's feasible, it's viable, it's repeatable, it's sustainable, it's scalable. All these aspects, how do they come into picture? Can you take it from here?
Thank you, Satish. Very simply, if any of the corporate leaders on this call had a set of tasks and a business to build, there would be literally thousands of experts who could respond to their questions, who could help them build that business. Many of those people would be inside their organizations, others would be tapped outside the organization. We sit here today with a simple question. What are the steps to reach scale? A very simple question. What are the steps to reach scale? 10 years ago, we asked that question of thousands of leaders without getting an answer. Now, we talked about the definition and the fact that scale is not well understood. So, as the next slide indicates, if you don't understand the definition, you're not likely to know the steps. Does that make sense? You should be able to define something before you can outline the steps to achieve it. Scale has actually been co-opted by growth experts who have decided that it's a cool word for saying big scale, big growth. So that's how lacking it is in experts, that some other group has just taken it over. So Satish mentioned the SDGs. And we could dive into any one of those SDGs, but the problem we're discussing today is the fact that only one of the 17 SDGs is actually scaling up. 16 of them are not. Now, you may be familiar with them. They're not your primary responsibility. But I'd encourage you to Google them and see if you agree. See if you can find another goal that is creating orders of magnitude improvement in that problem area. Now, the only goal that's scaling up, to my view, is renewable energy. It has a set of models, and those models can be applied, and they can be applied to scale up. It's digging out of a massive hole, the fossil fuels hole. And it will take decades to scale up to the level that solves the whole problem. So there you can see a clear indicator. The data is telling us something. What is the data telling us? The data is telling us that the world doesn't have a scale leader, and it needs one. That was the question we started with 10 years ago. We looked at 3,000 leaders who claimed to have scalable solutions to problems. 90% of those leaders would not have been able to engage the minister. They did not have an example of orders of magnitude improvement. They would have had the meeting canceled. 10% of them had that demonstrable scale progress at some level. And the remarkable thing about this was that although the 300 came from many different countries, 50 of the 300 came from one country, and that country is India. So as I said before, the data tells us the world does not have a scale leader. The data tells us that it needs one. Our data tells us that 50 of the 300 scale examples are in one country. Our data tells us that India is the only country that can actually be the world's scale leader and enable the many different capabilities that exist in this one country, including all the corporate capabilities, all the governmental capabilities, all the social innovation capabilities, all the entrepreneurship capabilities, all the technology capabilities, enabling all of those things to assemble into a process that can be applied broadly in India and broadly across the world. But how will that happen? How will that come into existence? That's what we're going to talk about. Back to you, Satish.
You know, you always talk about these 50 initiatives in India, which you find very, very interesting, and looking at India as the world's scale leader. My question is, as an Indian, I don't want to be the world leader. I want to solve first the problems of 90% challenges I have with my own people. How do we bring the last man to the level of capability to understand the world and see the world, feel the world, experience the world at the level at which humankind has progressed to? How do I get them to have clean water, have sanitation? Government began those programs. However, the results are not the way we expected. What has happened? How do you go about it? Why is it that when it comes to delivering services for the poor, we haven't succeeded in 70 years of freedom? And even though there are many initiatives and people are trying, but nothing has scaled up. What is the challenge that you see? Pick up any example. For instance, water. At one time, the government plan for rural water was to put up a hand pump in every village. And the hand pump went into the home of a mukhya, the chief of the village. And then again, local social structure decided who will end up using it. And then it fell in disuse, it was not maintained, and we forgot about it. We haven't looked at water question in decades, as I see. In cities, it was solved by those who came out and created bottled water. But you have addressed question of water. Why don't we just look at one aspect of water and what are the challenges and how we can address that, or pick up health, or pick up any of them? Can you walk us through how can India address just one of those aspects so that it brings together entrepreneurs, businesses, just like Shakti did, or eChopal did, or microfinance, and many initiatives that happen. How do you bring them together in a way that they begin to think of solving a problem at scale, the way you see it?
So that's a challenging question, Satish. And the fact that 16 of the goals are not scaling is an indicator that we are not making progress on answering that question. I'd like to pull back and say the first thing we need to do is we need to look at where we have scale. And we need to look at if having scale in those areas can help us address any of the questions you just raised. So that's a question for our listeners. That's a question about what has scale. You've mentioned that the communications example. Let's look at kind of the list of problems that are out there. The next slide gives you kind of a visual presentation of those. And you see communications in the center, and you see around it several almost as large words like acid rain and polio and smallpox, where a vaccine or a series of scientific collaborations enabled a problem to be solved at scale. So let's talk about communications. Let's look at how communications scaled. So this is a slide kind of summarizing what you said earlier. We built scale to reach 4 to 5 billion people through the internet, 2.5 to 3.5 billion people through social media. Every hour, 27,000 cell phones are attached to networks. And the killer apps and the content aggregation and the dramatic price decreases that scale made possible enabled these solutions to happen. So that's an image of what we would like to see happen in other areas. But this is a business where the consumers voted with their wallets to spend their money solving that problem. Not all the problems work that way. Let's go to the next slide. So the common denominator in communications is obviously networks. We are making the argument that networks to scale is the common denominator for all of the world's problems. If that's true, then we can learn things from the communication scale success, and we can apply them in other areas. Next slide. So the common denominator is networks and networks to scale. And it raises the question, is there any plausible reason that networks to scale isn't the answer for every problem? So let's take water as your example. There's a 100-page document that summarizes the announced plans of the new water ministry. They're doing some great work. They've recognized a couple of our scale leaders as some of the leading activators in the country. But only 2 pages of that 100-page document addresses technology. We know that virtually every solution that has scaled has been driven by adoption of technology. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happened and why it accelerated. But when you move to water, you have that same problem. The question is, how can you accelerate the adoption of things that change? Now, in the communications arena, there was a time before networks to scale took hold. It was the technology adoption time period. It was a confusing time period. The incumbents were unassailable. The startups could not make progress. And that situation changed. And it changed because of a specific series of knowledge deliveries that began and culminated with crossing the chasm. Crossing the chasm was a model, a system that was brought to the disruptors that showed them how they could leapfrog from the early adopters to the early majority. The two groups with totally different requirements had to be approached completely differently. Water will require the same kind of innovation. There are a number of new technologies that will come into play in the next decade. There will be a number of situations where those technologies need to leapfrog the existing technologies. There will be needs for the corporate sector and the government sector and the social innovation sectors to come together to make that happen. Right now, that's totally driven by profit. And what it means is that in certain situations, people are so profitable with the old technologies that they are aggressively working to keep the new technologies out. That was the same thing that was going on before crossing the chasm. We need to find the systems that enable those new technologies to cross the scale chasms the same way the other technologies did. Let's look at the result. Next slide. So here we have the current companies that every one of us know and work with every day. These are the crossing the chasm winners. But each one of these companies owns a dozen other winners, a dozen other technologies that started out, implemented their technology around management systems, around innovation, around operating systems, around the cloud, that made that technology become common knowledge and commonplace in the corporate world. So that's the same kind of thing that needs to happen in water. We need to have a new set of winners who enter the markets. They're there already. They're just not consolidating, and we're not concentrating resources around them. We're not making that happen. Next slide. So networks to scale is the common denominator for all of these. And they weren't just technology networks. We're defining networks as a group of leaders, the people who influence them, the people they influence, the connections that bring them together, and the outcomes that them connecting as a network can make possible and make happen. The instances of those networks are innumerable. The common theme is networks to scale. That's where we need to go. Back to you, Satish.
Okay, so how do we create new examples? For instance, in cell phone, I'm very clear about it. Technology made it possible to bring down the cost of installing a telephone from 50,000 rupees of 1985 to a very a fraction of it. The 50,085 will be today maybe more than 10 lakh rupees per person phone. Clearly, it's a small fraction of that as of now. What, technology addressing those issues is one thing, but how do networks that you talk about, the way they come together, how do they address problems at scale? I'm still a little foggy about that, and I'm trying to grapple with it. That without something becoming a global technology solution to a problem, for instance, it cannot be just planned. But yes, you can aim at it. At Harvard, I learned one thing, government of science and MIT management technology. I learned one thing, that you cannot govern technology, also you can't manage science. You can manage technology, you can govern science, and not vice versa. And there's a merit to that. It's a very interesting question that I saw people discussing at my time of my learning. Similarly, when it comes to solving a problem of human scale, which means addressing 7 billion people, Technologies have always come in the way. I'd like to focus on network because network makes it possible to aspire to change that even if technology doesn't exist. If you can give me some major examples of that, probably that will inspire people to try to find a solution at the scale as things should be handled. Would you like to address that?
Well, if we center around that question, is there any plausible reason that networks are not the common denominator for all of our problems? Then that means that there will be opportunities to address those other problems. And as the word cloud indicated, a number of those we've already addressed, and then we have all those other problems to deal with. And we need to seek a set of processes that enable us to get to scale across all of the problems. So the simple statement, if we can scale, we can win, illustrates the direction we need to go, but it doesn't answer the question of how. When you look at the networks that scaled communications, what you see is that they're a massive two-edged sword. They cut both ways. They take all comers. They take anyone's money. They let the users decide whether they care about progress or they care about going the other direction. So as a starting point, you need to think, is that going to take us to the solutions you're talking about? And our answer is no. The networks that take us to the solutions we're talking about, the networks that take us to scale, will not look like these neutral two-edged sword networks. So what will they look like? What will the crossing the chasm like models be for these new networks? Next slide. Next slide. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for models that enable us to expand these technologies across all the problem areas. Next slide. So the starting point is basically a question that's been asked. It's been asked by many different leaders. It's been asked by many different organizations, which is, can we go out and find the innovators who on the ground know how to solve the problems? And there are over 50 organizations that already do this. Those 50 organizations are where we found the 300 out of the 3,000, next slide, that we have focused on in building out this new set of processes. And I think what I should probably do is go into the next section and talk a little bit about our current situation. So communications solve problems at scale. And we then watched that happen. And we watched what organizations do. And you can see here the essence of that. Those 300 organizations led networks, and they used those networks to pull levers and pull them more effectively. And the world needs to learn how to do those two things. And the examples we'll talk about in a minute are important. But what's most important is to understand the level of shift and change that this represents. Now, we've had that level of change demonstrated to us very clearly. And that's been done by the arrival of COVID. When COVID arrived, it laid bare the lack of seriousness of some of the not so powerful countries and even many of the powerful countries. It laid bare our lack of investment in networks. It showed us that we didn't have networks to identify the sick people as they flowed through airports. We didn't have networks to contact trace. We didn't have networks to deliver PPE. We didn't have the healthcare networks to deal with those coming into the hospital. We didn't have the vaccine development networks that we're dealing with assembling right now on the fly. All of these networks either didn't exist at all or didn't exist at the scale that was necessary. The virus also exposed the talkers versus the doers. The doers, like Governor Andrew Cuomo, became overnight sensations. Their common sense advice delivered on television based on years of effort turned them into the guides that we sought. The talkers didn't deliver the solutions that the doers needed. And so we ended up in a situation where talkers were robbing the doers. They were stealing their credit. They were stealing the PPE that they'd arranged for and taking credit for it. So we've had an unleashed set of examples where we lacked the networks that we needed. Now, there's no reason those networks could not have existed, but it would have required a global effort to prepare for the future. So the case that we're making today is that that global effort needs to start today. Look at a simple. Go ahead.
You know, I'm trying to grapple with the whole idea of network as the cause of it or network as enabler, so that if I can understand, probably more people can understand that. Because I look at COVID situation is very different. Here, the global world order has put in about $8 to $10 trillion in about a span of just a few months, which is like extraordinary effort has been made. So I won't look at that as an example. I'm looking at an example where we as citizens, we working at the level we are, whether we are entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, we are policymakers, we are empowered government officers, we can make a difference from wherever we are looking at a challenge, any problem, and thinking of that problem solving at scale using networks. What do those networks look like? How do I identify that network? If you can help me understand, help us all understand, probably that will be taking us to the next stage.
So if you look at the current slide and you see those three simple steps, what you first have to realize is those networks will not be neutral. Those networks will be proactive. They will be designed to work on current visible problems. They will be designed to seek out current levers, ways that you can invest a small amount of resource and get 2x or 4x or 10x. And those networks will enable the pulling of those levers in ways that you get 4x instead of 2x. You get 10x instead of 5x. So that's a different kind of network. We call them purpose-built networks. How are purpose-built networks different? First of all, they're not neutral. They actually go and work on problems, but they also do things in ways that enable the solutions to those problems to be more effective and more scalable. We've identified two categories of those capabilities. And the categories you're looking at right now are what we call purpose capability. And the purpose capabilities enable the collaboration across disparate groups and disparate networks and disparate organizations, such that those groups come together and in essence create a meta network, a larger network than any one of them controls or knows or understands. So what do? They design work to create outcomes. An example, enabling a single teacher in a remote school to teach 3 to 8-year-olds everything they need to know to be successful at government schools. That is work design that is unbelievably challenging, but it will transform those remote villages. Aggregating enough leaders to create 15,000 schools and bring 150,000 teachers together and graduate 63 million kids, where none of those leaders are paid. Only the teachers are paid. A massive leader aggregation effort, virtually unknown outside of India. Time doesn't really permit us to go into detail on all of these, but if we go to the next slide, you'll see the two organizations that I'm talking about. I was in Delhi. I asked a conference of 300 people 3 years ago, what are the two most scaled education organizations serving the poor in the world? In India, I could not get those questions answered. These are those two organizations, Vidya Bharati, Ekal Vidalya. Ekal is the one that designed the training and selection system that gets teachers who will stay in the villages for 10 to 15 years and then invests heavily in training them so they can handle that amazingly challenging task. Both Vidya Bharati and Ekal have created broad networks of leaders, people who, when they're fully employed, spend a significant part of their time building out a 15,000 school system, building out 100,000 single teacher schools in remote villages without receiving a penny, but receiving the gratification of transforming education for 63 million kids in the urban and peri-urban environments, and I don't even know how many in the 100,000 villages. Massively cost effectiveness delivers through both of these organizations. Ekal delivers 100,000 schools for what it would cost us to run 3 schools in the United States. $50 million, a little more than that, gets you 100,000 schools. Vidya Bharati does a similar cost effectiveness so that a person earning $5 a day and only spending 5% of their income can send their child to school. So these networks look like these capabilities. They are smaller, they are focused, they are designed to reach network effects. The next slide shows the 5 scale capabilities. These scale capabilities are corresponding to the purpose capabilities. Next slide, please. Now, we don't have time to go into these, but what you see here is that every one of these capabilities is used by these two organizations in very significant ways to reach scale. The money flows to Ekal as soon as people see how cost effective they are. Vidya Bharati recovers 80% of its spend from its customers, from those parents. It uses alliances and networks to reach out and find those parents who are willing to spend their resources and put them into that mechanism. So that's one description of how the networks will look. And those are 2 examples that every company in India could learn from. Every company could see that we need millions of these networks, these small 10, 20, 100,000 people networks that focus on the specific problems that are critical to any country being successful. We have with Corona and a situation where jobs are being destroyed. We want to get those jobs back. The networks that we need to get those jobs back don't fully exist. The companies are faced with calling out to partners to help them, and they don't have the partners that they need to have. The companies need to actually create those partnerships today so that they can respond to the next crisis, so that the next time something is destroying jobs, they can fight back. that they can win by scaling through a collaboration between their own capabilities and the capabilities of these millions of purpose-built networks that we need to create.
You know, I totally agree that Ekal and Vidya Bharati are great examples of creating, taking an idea to the network to scale. 100,000 schools, single teacher schools in 100,000 villages is an incredible job done. The challenge there I would face is, are we helping those children become capable of dealing with the world the way it's unfolding in front of us? Is the quality of education at a level that we can help them think not just of literacy, not just of knowledge, but at the level of critical thinking and imagination, just like the world is doing? So the point is, yes, it is addressing question in the context it can, as best as it can, and it's a great job done. But then other things remain. Vidya Bharati, an amazing experience in some ways, that they have addressed at much fewer resources the quality of education that other institutions are struggling to provide, and making it so affordable. Affordability and growth that these two institutions offer is incredible. Can we create similar examples for addressing healthcare, for example? Healthcare is a very, very crying need of the poor and everyone, as a matter of fact, and we are seeing serious distortions there. Can you imagine, can you work with people? Can you help them to go to think about how to address challenges of healthcare, of sanitation, of the 5 major or 6 major SDGs? I'm not concerned about the platform SDGs, which we are thinking about different issues. My interest is in poverty eradication, offering people water that is potable, looking at education, looking at health, looking at, for instance, transportation. These are the key challenges. How can we help them using networks? If you can think aloud, share with us your wisdom and thought.
Well, so I selected 4 organizations to talk about beforehand, Satish. So Esha, please bring up that slide. But you're asking really a different question. And we talked about this in a different way. If you look at what India is attempting to do, they are about to go from a $2 trillion economy to a $5 trillion economy. And currently they spend between 1% and 2% on healthcare. The next step will be to go from a $5 trillion economy to a $10 trillion economy. And the target for that will be roughly 2030. When India is a $10 trillion economy, what part of that economy will be health, healthcare, water, those together? It will be $1 trillion. So India is about to increase the share of spend from 1% to 2% to 9% to 10%, while the economy grows 5x during the same 10 years. That has never been attempted before. Never. So I can give you Vidya Bharati and Ekal examples in healthcare, and to be blunt, they don't matter. They only matter if the entire network of companies and governments and social innovators and influencers come together and do the things that are fairly obvious should be done. So I'm arguing that these purpose-built networks can make that happen. I'm also arguing that the companies need to engage and build a significant portion of those networks with their employees that help the companies. Couple of examples. When the World Health Organization and several other bodies came to corporate pharma a few years ago and said, we would like to encourage you to collaborate with us to build out a set of vaccine development capabilities that will significantly expand our ability to respond to pandemics, the corporate pharma said no. They declined to participate. Do you see why that was not the right thing to do? If their organizations had been filled with people who had networks out working on these problems, they could not have said no, because their own employees would have risen up and said, no, we should do that. We see that happening today around Black Lives Matter, around the rights of African Americans in the United States. We see companies attempting to be lackadaisical and their employees rising up and saying, no, we will not accept that. Part of that is because in those situations over the last 5 years, hundreds of thousands of those employees have participated in these networks. It's also because events have called to attention the need to do it for those who didn't. So the answer to your question is bigger than any set of examples. It's not enough to have 50 social innovators in healthcare that we can call out and say, aren't they doing a wonderful job? The ecosystem has been brought from New Mexico to Ayushman Bharat in India to serve as the communications system that is optimized to enable doctors around any disease to collaborate to expand the capability of the Indian system, which is deficient in capability and deficient in networks, enabling it to expand very rapidly. Why very rapidly? Because we're doing 5x economy and 5x share. That system is enabling rapid movement around hepatitis B, rapid movement around a number of other diseases. It will now enable conversations around COVID.
David, what you are saying is addressing a challenge.
Happen, now you can.
David, what you're addressing is looking at a crisis, looking at a problem, looking at a human situation, looking at a social challenge. But no matter how many people come together, it won't solve a water problem or a sanitation problem. It requires thinking through how do we provide water in an affordable way, in a profitable way, in a way that all the stakeholders feel great about solving a problem. That's when it will probably achieve scale. Maybe I'm seeing from another point of view, and that's the purpose of such conversations. They help us find a solution because we all see things from where we sit.
Okay.
From where I sit, a challenge of water or sanitation or ending poverty, this is not by giving a clarion call. People by coming on the road will not solve that. It requires thinking just like in communication. It was not solved by some government minister who didn't have proper education or the very brilliant public servant officer who became secretary of a government. It was not solved by them. It was solved by people who were working for a long time thinking about how to solve a problem. Now, I'm looking for solutions to the basics that 90% of my countrymen need, and that is how to have clean water, sanitation, how to address the question of poverty, how to address the question of education and health. So how do we create those networks which are triggering these solutions, maybe not in 1 year, maybe in 5 years? How do they sustain themselves? How do they go to achieve a problem solution at scale? That will be something very relevant and valuable to all of us, if you can think of it.
The actual examples on the screen are excellent for that question. So most people think about water, they think about pipes. They think about it showing up at their sink. Tarun Bharat Singh is not a recognizable name to most of the people listening today, but many of the people may have heard of the Waterman of India. Now, if you want to have water arrive at your sink, it turns out you have to start further back in the process. And 30 years ago in Rajasthan, Rajendra Singh realized that his entire state was becoming a desert. The rain had ceased to fall on Rajasthan's side of the mountains. Most people would have been completely helpless. Most people would have said, there's nothing I can do about that. Rajendra Singh said, let's try. And he then went out into the mountainsides, went out into the villages of Rajasthan, and he assembled networks of citizens, and he said to them, we can't let this continue. Let's work together. Let's experiment. Let's see if we could plant in various patches enough ground cover and enough vegetation to begin to change our water problem. Their water problem was very fundamental. There wasn't any water falling from the sky. They did that. They literally changed the rainfall patterns in Rajasthan. And any person in this room can hop in a car from Delhi or from Jaipur and drive up through the Rajasthan countryside and see the greenery and the after pictures. And you can go back and look with Rajendra Singh at the before pictures and you will be stunned. This was an actual application of networks to scale with no communications technology other than pulling the citizens together in groups and walking up the mountainside and working. They developed a whole set of innovations and techniques that resulted in Rajendra Singh receiving the World Water Prize in 2015. I was sitting in a room in Stockholm with about 100 people, first session of the conference, preview of the World Water Prize winner. Up walked this modest man in his white Indian attire and showed me those before and after pictures. I was amazed. You would be amazed. He just got from the Water Ministry the Water Warriors Prize. The first Water Warriors Prize for India ever given went to Rajendra Singh. That is an actual example on the ground that has now spread to Maharashtra, to Karnataka, to Bangalore. But it needs to spread to almost the entire country. And the rate at which it takes Rajendra Singh and his colleagues to spread it, working in today's network mode, isn't fast enough. There needs to be networks building and inviting Tarun Bharat Sangh to come and engage and work with them. That's what needs to happen. That's what we need to do across the entire country. Let me use the US example here first. In the US, there are millions of poor kids, and poverty in the US is different than poverty in India. Poverty in the US can be being in a classroom where most of the kids have their own books and the poor kids don't. It turns out there are millions of books thrown away every year, or there used to be. They were thrown away because they couldn't sell them for $15. So a group of social entrepreneurs got together and built 3 networks. They built a network to assemble all of those books from all of the publishers. They built a network to engage the corporations to contribute to lower the price of those books. And they built a network that has captured 500,000 teachers that serve those kids. And those 3 networks work together now to move those $15 books to those kids for $1.50 each. 5 to 10 million books per year, $1.50 each, plus all of the other supplies that they deliver, plus all of the other services they deliver. It's almost $100 million marketplace serving those children and those teachers. And during COVID, because it was network-based, it could adapt to COVID very rapidly. Its sales tanked and recovered in 6 weeks as they shifted the model to at-home solutions, at-home support, at-home content to support the teachers who were teaching through Zoom and other platforms. So there are two examples where the most basic of networks and highly sophisticated networks were needed to deliver a new set of solutions at scale for the state of Rajasthan, at scale for 1/3 of all the teachers that teach poor children in the United States, at scale through networks.
I would say that no matter what Tarun Bharat Sangh does a great job, but it hasn't solved in 100 years or 30 years or 40 years the challenge of water for India, for all the villages of India, for all those who have water challenges. It is still an initiative, which is a voluntary initiative, which has achieved a huge level of success in some ways, has been recognized for that. But the challenge is, it has not gone the way, for instance, in a defined 5-6 years time frame, Polio Plus covered everyone, or smallpox challenges, or eradication of malaria. Those things happen in a defined time frame. Something was achieved because it was a state or network at a very high level initiative, like WHO, UNICEF, Rotary, and then Rotary clubs and people coming together in case of polio. But what I was hoping is that you will talk about how do we bring businesses into solving a problem, thinking about it in such a way that we can look at solving it for all the billion Indians who are facing that, or all those who are disenfranchised globally, they can handle that. These are the examples of people waking up to a challenge, some leaders emerging somewhere, doing a great job, great success in their own environment, which is fine. But scale to me means the way it means to government, that we deal with every single citizen. How do we address a problem that we can take every single citizen to the level of achievement that we think is viable today? And that's where my focus is. And I would request you to, so for instance, we want to solve a problem of providing primary health care to every villager in the country. How do we address that question through networks? And how do we scale there? Are you there?
Let's take the next slide. I think my message is actually quite simple, Satish. Those are questions that we need to answer, but they are not questions that I can answer today. They are questions that need to be asked of 100 different organizations across India. We need to pose those questions to those organizations as a group. We need to assemble those organizations into teams. We need to pick the best people from each of those organizations to work on probably 30 or 40 different teams. And we need to begin to have those conversations where the social innovators and the corporations come together. We need to do that aggressively and proactively. And each one of those teams will build a network out from that process. And each one of those networks will begin to answer
Have we lost you? Hello? David? Okay, I hope you can hear me. In which case, I will say while David comes back online, maybe he can hear us. My approach to solving such challenges is try to take a step back, rethink the whole issue, try to find, given current state of technology and possibilities and people's willingness to accept the solution, what is viable. For instance, I mean, I love ACAL solution. I've been part of their various bodies, etc. at various points in time. I'm also been invited to the board of Vidya Bharati in some ways. I've been supporting them. But the way I look at it, I can take it to the next stage of quality. So one organization called EduFront, I'm supporting that organization. What they did was, how do you give remote education in affordable ways at a quality level so that someone in $5 a month can have the kind of experience of learning, which is possible only in $10,000 annual schools in the US and so on and so forth. It won't be exactly that, but in overall learning, probably we'll get there. So that's my approach. We bring in technology, try to begin addressing the problem, take a step back, rethink, re-envision, reimagine, and see what's viable, and can we make it feasible, can we make it sustainable, and then can we make it repeatable? And now we go to scale. And that's the way I would go. David, are you there? Are you back? Hello?
He's surely logged in, but I don't know whether he can hear us.
Okay. In which case, I don't have the slides, and even if I have the slides, I probably can't see them because of the color and the small screen that I have. Well, why don't I take the questions from people? If someone can read, if there are any questions, that'd be nice.
Uh, Satish ji, would you mind if I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah. In fact, I have personally worked with several of these social organizations as part of one of the funding agency and worked with them very closely. And most of the time, in fact, I have also worked with Tarun Bharat Sangh, Rajinder Singh ji, for their Rajasthan related water activities. So what I have noticed, that most of them, rather only a few of them could scale up, but most of them have not been able to go beyond a certain region or beyond a certain thing. So they set themselves, so they can't scale up. So I think some of those have already been answered by David in his this thing. But if you can just also take these examples also for the startups, because these are social enterprises, and what we have learned through maybe the Ekal or Vidya Bharati example or cooperative example of Amul and Tarun Bharat Sangh, how these could be also replicated by budding entrepreneurs or startups or innovators. If you can throw some light
Well,
on that.
thank you so much. Your questions are my questions as well, but I can share with you how I handle that. For instance, when MIT created the possibility of changing the way education happens with this one laptop per child project, I'll walk you through how they imagined, how they thought about it. They looked at in a clean greenfield situation on a clean slate. What are the challenges, for instance, of education in a remote place? Well, it has only one classroom. Probably the classroom actually is not really a classroom; it's under a tree. Probably the teacher does not have capacity to take them to the next stage. Probably, you can't even educate a teacher to a quality level. They began thinking about that. And they embodied all that in something called One Laptop Per Child little piece of product, which was designed in 2005 and announced at the United Nations summit, which happened, I think, in Tunis in 2005, Global Summit at that point in time. It went to a few million people later on. But what it did was amazing. It created in 2005 or 6 a screen which you could see under the sun. Created for the first time a laptop which actually could be charged for 8 9 hours. It could be charged if electricity, if not by battery, if not by hand crank, if not by solar power. Effectively said, no matter what, I can keep working. It
Yeah.
filled it up with kind of ability to connect with two laptops without anyone interfering. In other words, if there were 25-volt PC laptops, they were self-networking and we could talk to each other. So my point is to do that requires a tremendous effort by leaders who bring us back to the blackboard, rethink the issue. Another way is, well, I want to just do it and go ahead and do it. Tarun Bharat Sangh example, someone else has to come and look at that and distill the lessons of that and try to take it to the next stage. But someone has to learn from it, take it backstage, and then go to the next. I think David is back.
Yeah, he's
David,
back. Yeah.
okay, we were talking about Gajendra's questions, which are also my questions, basically. And Gajendra, I think you did a great job. Why didn't you say it again?
David, what in fact Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so my question was, while it's always good to have a perspective from the other side, because I myself have worked with these social enterprises as a part of a funding agency and worked very closely with Rajendra Singh ji and many of these social enterprises. So, in fact, what I why do some social enterprises are able to scale up like Vidya Bharati is, and whereas while you have already answered some of those in your presentation, but many or more than 99% of them are not able to scale up. And the lessons also, because many in this audience are from startups, innovators, social organizations. So how these budding entrepreneurs can learn from those experiences, your experiences in that regard. So this is my question.
Great question. I'm going to try to give it three answers. And they're really just slightly different answers for all of the listeners. If you're in the early stages and you're asking questions like, what are the root causes of the problem? Who on the ground can solve the problem? How do I organize to solve the problem on the ground? And how do I pull together the influences and the resources to solve the problem? You simply need to add, and who has done it at scale? Who has scaled up in that area? Now, if you're working on an area, there are already scale up examples. You need to go find those. You need to make those your own. You need to decide if you have a better solution. It may be better to go help the other solution scale. If you don't have a solution that can scale and they do, that scale question, it's like scale is the minimum viable product for any social solution. Just like investors and entrepreneurs talk about a minimum viable product around their segment of market they're going after, social entrepreneurs are going after much bigger segments. And so scale is the minimum viable product for those people. Now, that same thing applies to corporations. If you ran the corporate CSR activities through that exact same set of questions, you would completely change the way every company in India does CSR. Completely. You would probably cancel 90% of the things that you're doing. And you would consolidate around the 10% that can actually scale. And that 10% would need partners. And you would go find those partners and you would bring them together in networks and you would take that 10% to scale. But today, because we bring in a lot of nonprofit people to run those parts of the business, we end up doing what the nonprofits do. That's crazy. It doesn't make any sense to have corporations doing things that way. The reason we need the corporations is to show us how to do them the other way.
Okay. David, let me capture some questions which have come, and if you can write them down, that'd be great, and you can take one by one because sometimes it's hard to handle. Now, someone asks, social impact bonds. Are they being used in India or something you know about that you can share? Someone basically says that they are interested in why is it that Amul, as a great experiment in India, did not cut across other activities in the cooperative movement, so to say. Someone is looking at what are the probable teams that should network around water to push the solution for water sector. Someone is asking, how do you create e-schools and what kind of network will be required to propel e-schools and solve a big challenge of quality in education rather than just literacy, as many other initiatives have handled. Now, we don't have much time. You have probably about 10 minutes to go. So if you can take 1 minute, 1.5 minutes each and address, that'd be great.
Let's kind of put them all together because they all are impactful. Let's take Amul to start with, because if you go back and look at the history of Amul, what you find is that in the early part of that history, there were some amazing innovations. And the thing that really spawned it was a partnership between the World Food Program and Kurian and the original founders who brought him in to borrow money using the World Food Program's butter, oil, and milk powder inventories as collateral. Now, today, we have a buzzword called blended finance. And you will hear lots of financial experts talking about that buzzword. What you have with Amul is actual blended finance. It's not a buzzword. It's figuring out how those inventories, instead of giving them to India to destroy the dairy industry, use them as collateral to upgrade the dairy industry. Social impact bonds are a perfect example of the financial innovation arriving from financial people and never being adapted to the reality of scale. So the answer with respect to social impact bonds is they were working on the wrong problem. They were testing models in situations where poor countries already had lots of proven models that they needed to scale. They didn't need to test and add more models to the inventory. They needed to scale the models they already had. So what was needed was not a social impact bond that tested models. What was needed was a scale bond that scaled proven models. The financial innovation can work exactly the same. You borrow the money, you commit to the scale results. The person who wants the scale results pays back the money when they're achieved. But because the impact bond didn't make that transition, they didn't ask the scale question. They didn't use the minimum viable product to analyze their own innovation. And so many people talked about it that it never occurred to anybody that it was not the right idea. So the same thing happens when you look at water. In water, there are areas where we need massive increases in investment and effort. We need massive increases in figuring out how to use less water in agriculture. Everybody knows that. And yet, only one of the innovations that's come forward has been taken to scale, drip irrigation. In Hyderabad and in Telangana, they just finished building the largest water pump in the world. So in the entire world, the largest water pump in the world is in Telangana. That is a new approach. It is a new innovation, but it will require drip irrigation on the other end of the innovation to make it effective, unless we find a better solution than drip irrigation that can take advantage of being integrated with the whole strategy. So there's all three examples. You could use a scale bond to do the initial assembly of all the alternatives that could be attached in a variety of metaphorical ways to the pump. And you could use the existence of the pump to drive those experiments. That assembly of the corporate and financial resources to drive that experiment could be the difference between success and failure of the largest water pump in the world.
No, I see the point you're making. To the question on e-schooling, I would say,
you're better to answer that than I am, Satish.
All right, since you asked me to. Okay, so, I have been looking at the questions of how do we use technology? How do you create a cell phone of educational challenge that we can help every child, no matter what the resources, learn at the level of creativity, critical thinking, and imagination, just like anyone else, with as little resources as necessary, or whatever we may have at a certain point in time. So look at this way, the $100 is an average what the world spends on giving a non-quality education every year. and $10,000 is being used to give something which is more than just non-quality, more than quality that we can handle today. Now, somewhere in between, if you can handle something in what poor societies, poor and resource poor societies are able to handle, that will be interesting. So we found a way of delivering schools per child with the content, digital content, which is just in about $2 to $3 a month. They can handle that. We can create in about $5, $6 infrastructure, which can be per student, that is, which can take it to the next stage. Now we're just beginning to address that because of the current situations, and there is now a demand for that. So in other words, a calamity like pandemic has helped us rethink about issues which 10 years back, when I talked in terms of one laptop per child, wasn't as acceptable. It was fascinating. People loved it, but nobody took the next step to go to take it to the quality level. But today, people are beginning to look at it. So I think EduFront is doing something at the level of setting a new standard or benchmark at which things can be delivered, and I hope that scales up, for instance. But the challenge is when you run a government as either the leader of the country or running a department as a minister or a secretary is, how do we handle these situations given the resources, given the technology, given the willingness of our own people around us to accept an idea, and how do you run with it? And that challenge is specific and unique in every situation. The network idea appealed to me that maybe we can create networks in such a way they can begin to create a body of opinions, a body of knowledge, body of, you can say, convergence of thought by looking at from the tomorrow's point of view, not from yesterday's point of view. We create a network of bodies which allow that sufficiency of argument to emerge so that we can enable the government to take the next best stage, not just in terms of just touching and checking the boxes, but in terms of actually providing a quality solution. I think we are past the point of checking the boxes, which is a compulsion. If I was in the government, probably I'll do the same thing. But because I've been outside of it, since I've always wanted to remain outside, I was able to see things differently. The point is, if you can't provide a quality solution, is it really helping someone, or is it just I'm doing my job? Second point I would like to do is, unless a solution helps lots of people, thousands of them, to make it viable in terms of their own affordability and viability, repeatability, and scalability, I don't think we can really find something. We should go to the next stage. That's the way I think, David. I think we are running out of time. So I'll hand it over to Vicky. But my point is, why don't you just take 15 seconds and sum up and then hand it over to Vicky.
So let me just quickly
One request, David, if you can switch on your video, we also would like to see your good face.
Is it on now?
But don't lose time.
Is it on now?
Yeah,
Yes,
now it's on.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. So right now we're losing jobs because of COVID. But before COVID, we had a lot of job destruction in the news. Do you remember? What was it? It was around artificial intelligence. It was all over the news. So even before COVID, we knew that lots of large organizations were going to use technology to decrease the number of humans, talent they use. So that's our situation. We know that large companies can solve part of our problems. We know that large companies can solve some of the other problems outside those companies. But we also know they're going to be employing fewer people. So ask yourself the following question. What's easier to imagine? That we'll just stick with the big companies solving the problems and a few social entrepreneurs, and the rest of us will sit around doing nothing and collecting universal income checks. Is that easy to imagine? For me, that's really hard to imagine. It's much easier for me to imagine that a new form of work, a new form of collaboration, a new form of networks
will assemble and create ways to use massive amounts of human talent solving the rest of the problems that the big organizations aren't going to solve. That's way easier for me to imagine than imagining doing nothing and collecting a universal income check. So when I say networks to scale is the answer, I'm simply saying it's the only way that the world has seen and that our network has seen to use that talent and to solve those problems. And we are wide open to any other suggestions. But if the two alternatives are build purpose-built networks and solve the problems, or do nothing and collect universal income checks, I'm going with the first.
Yeah, great, David. I think it was really an engaging session, and I rarely, because I do organize many of these workshops, and it is extremely difficult to engage wide audience from different setup for 1.5 hours, and you really uh, great job. And I hope the social entrepreneurs, the startups, the CEOs, the NGOs, these must have benefited with your presentation, a great presentation. It is also going live on YouTube, are watching on YouTube as well. So, and also to my participants who have been with us for more than 1.5 hours. So I believe many of those questions have not been answered, but we have taken a note of those questions, and we will try to respond to them over email to all of you. And we will also share with you a link to this lecture. And thanks once again, David, and thanks once again, Satish ji, for partnering with Wiki, and it is indeed actually beneficial for our members, and we are giving good value to our members. So I would like to just once again thank everyone, including Isha, for sharing all those slides to us. And so barring those some technical glitches, I think we had a great session. Thanks everyone, Dheeraj from my team, and uh, several and Isha and all from your team. So and Chetan. Thank you everyone,
Thank you.
and I think
Thank you.
we have some more great sessions in